Introduce myself to the panel.
Oh,
I'm Theresa Doyle, and let's see, Devin Adams and Eugene Youngblood. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Great. Oh, and there's Representative Hackney.
Hello,
How are you doing?
fine, how are you?
Good. We didn't have much success last session. I'm hoping things improve this session.
I hope so too.
Great.
well, to the folks joining as attendees, thank you for coming. We're going to give it just another minute to let some other folks join, and we'll begin our program. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started as folks come in. I want to start by thanking everyone for joining FAMM and Look to Justice today for this important conversation on the very urgent need to expand Washington's existing second look law to include emerging adults, those who are sentenced for offenses committed before their 25th birthday. I just want to jump right into it to help frame our discussion today. I'd like to share a quick video that FAMM put together with the help of Look to Justice and your friend Eugene Youngblood. You know, at FAMM, we really believe in the power of storytelling to help advance our criminal justice reform policies. And so this video here tells the story of one of our panelists, Eugene Youngblood, who was incarcerated for over 2 decades, starting when he was 18. We're so grateful that he's out and with us today. And I just want to share a video highlighting his story.
I was incarcerated long before I ever stepped foot in prison. I was free long before I got released. I went to prison at 18. I was struggling with issues. I was going through trauma, and you know, I was violent. I had a lot of outbursts and things like that. After serving 29 years, I was released on clemency. Even well before clemency, I had decided that I want to live with integrity. I want to be this kind of guy. I want to be a respected member of my community. It might have been appropriate to give me a long sentence when I was 18, but when I was 30 or 35, somebody should have had an opportunity to look back and see, had I had any personal growth.
In 2014, Washington State passed legislation that allowed anyone who was given a life or long sentence under the age of 18 to be eligible to go before the review board. That process has been immensely successful. Since then, folks have come home, like Eugene, who are doing incredible work.
Getting out is the answer for a lot of other young people, and we have to try to instill that hope.
Youngblood has been a leader in the push for new legislation that would expand the second look sentencing mechanism to include most people who've committed an offense before their 25th birthday and have served at least 15 years in prison.
As a former federal prosecutor, my role was to keep the community safe by, prosecuting individuals who cause violence and harm. In hindsight, I am alarmed at the draconian sentences that some of these individuals are currently serving. I recognize that after a certain period of time, the danger that they pose to the community really no longer exists.
And so who we are is always more important than what we have done. And that's why this second chance and this second look is so important, because there are so many people on the inside right now who are waiting and ready to do not just what I'm doing, but just to live life and to be functional in society and to really come out and show that they're capable of doing this as well.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that short video. I just think this power of storytelling is so important, and we'll make that public and shareable after today's event. So next, I'd like to introduce State Representative David Hackney to provide some introductory remarks. Representative Hackney was first elected in 2020 to represent the 11th Legislative District in the Washington House of Representatives. His district covers Renton, Tukwila, and parts of Kent. Rep. Hackney was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and has lived in different states before attending college at Cornell University in New York, and later earning a law degree and master's degree in public administration from Harvard. Following law school, he served as an assistant United States attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he tried more than 20 criminal jury trials, including homicide, narcotics, fraud, tax, and bank robbery cases. He also worked for the UN in The Hague, Netherlands, as a war crimes prosecutor, and as senior counsel for the Global Human Rights Resources at the Nature Conservancy. In 2019, he was appointed by Governor Inslee to the Washington Human Rights Commission. In addition to serving in the legislature, Rep. Hackney currently works as the Economic Development Manager for the Clean Tech Alliance. In Olympia, he serves as Vice Chair of the Capital Budget Committee. He sits on the Public Safety Committee and the Transportation Committees. And most important to our discussion, in 2021 and 2022, he was the sponsor for House Bill 1344, which would expand the existing second look mechanism to include most people who committed their offense before their 25th birthday and have served 15 years. So Representative Hackney, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you for that kind introduction. So again, David Hackney, representing the 11th Legislative District in South King County. You know, one of the reasons that I'm here, I think, is because I'm a lifelong learner. And I realize that I have learned more from my lived experience than I ever have from the fancy schools that I attended. Sorry, we got a fire truck. As I reflect back on my life and on my lived experiences, I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned. As a child, I remember that I've had members of my both immediate and extended family who were incarcerated. I recognized that those gentlemen were important parts of our family and that we loved them and we missed them when they were gone. And I then also recognized one of the most important things that they needed to recover from and to be the person they could be was family. And that was the very thing that was taken away from them. I also reflect on my time as a federal prosecutor. During the 1990s, politicians were made popular by 3 strikes laws and 2 strikes. The more time you could give someone, the more popular you were. And I was a tool in that machinery. I thought that I was doing my job by giving the harshest sentence that the law would allow. I recognize now that those harsh sentences did not make my community any safer. They did not act as a deterrent. And what they actually did was they ignored the humanity of the individuals that I prosecuted, and we threw their lives away. And not only that, but it's a serious waste of money. I shudder to think about the individuals that I prosecuted who are now rattling around federal institutions with walkers and canes and needing oxygen, who pose no danger to anyone. Yet we are spending money to incarcerate them with security 24 hours a day, fences, dogs, correctional officers, when in fact, if you open the door of the facilities, they wouldn't really have the ability to leave on their own. And then I reflect back to a small group discussion I had with Eugene Youngblood. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said to me, once again, fire truck. He said to me that, people are often better than the worst things that they had ever done.
Mhm.
And when those words hit me, I realized it was not just my family members or the people that I had prosecuted that taught me things. It was also my own personal experience. As a teenager in high school, at a suburban Catholic high school in Columbus, Ohio, my group of friends decided that it was cool to take TNT that we had found in my friend's garage and make pipe bombs. We took actual pieces of metal, we stuffed them with rocks, glass, and nails. We fastened them together and we lit them and we threw them out of moving cars. And you don't have to be a physics major to know that when you throw a piece of metal out of a moving car, you have no control over where it lands. You don't know whether someone's going to be walking down the street, getting out of a car, opening a door to find death, serious injury, or maiming someone. Thank God no one was seriously injured. And as a result, those serious crimes were treated as petty mischief and vandalism, and they were not seriously pursued by the police. But I also reflected on another friend of mine who you would do the same thing, but he used just regular old Molotov cocktails, beer bottles soaked with gasoline and rags. Unfortunately, he threw one into an elementary school just a few blocks from my house that was recently built. It was spanking brand new, had never been used. And with the fire that consumed it, it burned the building to the ground. So that was real consequences. And the FBI and the ATF and all the investigative agencies came out and they found out exactly who did it. And I remember the day they drugged my friend out of our high school in handcuffs, in tears. We all thought we would never see him again. In fact, I didn't see him again until 25 years later at a high school reunion. I was shocked. I tapped him on the shoulder. I said, "Chris, is that you?" And he looked me dead in the eye. He said, "Yeah, but it's Dr. Fredericks now. I'm an emergency room physician at Ohio State." And what that taught me again was we are always better than the worst thing that we'd ever done. What I was doing as a teenager was trying to get the attention of my friends. I did not think about the long-term consequences of my action. I wasn't trying to maim or kill anyone. I can imagine a prosecutor like me having me on the stand and said, "Well, if you weren't trying to kill and hurt anybody, why would you stuff it with rocks and nails and glass?" I had no explanation. We did not in any way intend to hurt anyone, and thank God we didn't. Someone saw something in my buddy Chris, and after he did his time, he was allowed to go to school and be the person that he can become and serve our community as an emergency room physician. It's a lesson that sticks with me, and it also guides me in the legislature. We are often better than the worst thing that we've ever done. We need to provide opportunities for individuals to come out of incarceration and to live meaningful lives and contribute to society. We are wasting money and we are ignoring the humanity of individuals who have done wrong and have deserved some punishment. But they also deserve another chance to be contributing members of society, to get back with their families who need them and who they need, and to live a happy life. And I'm dedicated to that as a legislator. I'm dedicated as a member of our community. These lifelong lessons in different phases of my life kind of guide me in my professional career. So I am very happy to be here and to give these introductory remarks. I'm very happy for the work that FAMM does and Look to Justice. I'm very proud of the panel members and what they've accomplished and what they've achieved and what they are all teaching us by the lives that they are living post-incarceration. They are living examples of what we can do when we give people additional opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Hackney. I would just echo I think that's sort of the motto and the basis of our work is we're all more than the worst thing we've done. And I appreciate you sort of driving that home. I'd now like to introduce our esteemed panel, beginning with Eugene Youngblood, who we got a quick taste of his story in the video. Eugene is a facilitator and community engagement specialist with the Washington Freedom Project. Eugene was arrested in 1991 at 18 years of age and thankfully released in March of 2021 at the age of 48 after serving nearly 30 years. He was set to spend the rest of his life in prison, but in June 2019, the Washington Clemency and Pardons Board voted unanimously to recommend release after seeing that his personal transformation and the work that he did with other incarcerated individuals was simply extraordinary. As I mentioned, he now serves as the facilitator and community engagement specialist with the Washington Freedom Project. As part of this work with the Freedom Project, he supports currently incarcerated individuals as they seek their own resentencing and hopeful release. Next, we have Devin Adams, who's the fundraising and development director at Collective Justice. Devin spent 15 years in prison, contributing to the wellness and uplifting of the incarcerated community. He's an experienced speaker and presenter with the Choices and Consequences program, working with students, at-risk youth, counselors, and educators. He also held many leadership positions in the Black Prisoners Caucus. He was a lead facilitator, organizer, coordinator, liaison between other organizations, groups, and communities within and outside the prison. Devin has been an instrumental figure in the Concerned Lifers organization, where he presented their yearly summits, worked with legislators, as well as various community organizations. He's a graduate of the HEAL program, a 54-week restorative justice circle for individuals who have contributed to and experienced serious harm. Devin also holds a bachelor's of specialized studies from The Ohio University, which he received through his participation with the University Behind Bars program. And last but certainly not least, Judge Theresa Doyle, who retired from King County Superior Court at the end of 2020. She was elected to that court in 2004 and was a Seattle Municipal Court judge from 1998 to her election in 2004. She has presided over many hundreds of jury trials in her 22-year career. In King County Superior Court, Judge Doyle served as Assistant Chief Criminal Judge and spent her last 2 years in the court in the juvenile department. She has been a trailblazer in advocating for wide pretrial release, decarceration, and diversion of juveniles and adults out of the legal system and into community programs. As a judge, Theresa Doyle has been a recognized leader in racial justice and legal system reform. She has conducted trainings for judges and attorneys and written articles, one of which has been added to the chat, and I highly encourage you to read, about implicit racial bias, addressing biases in jury selection, jury pool diversity, bail reform, legal financial obligations reform, structural racism in the legal system, and how to be an anti-racist judge. She's an active member of the Minority and Justice Commission, where she chairs the Rules and Legislation Committee and is a member of the Juvenile Justice Committee. As an attorney, Theresa Doyle spent most of her career as an appellate public defender, and she was a law clerk at the Washington Court of Appeals, as well as the California Court of Appeals in San Francisco. So we clearly have a very impressive panelists here today. I would like to open up with a question for Judge Doyle. Basically, how did Washington end up here? How did we end up with so many young people serving extreme sentences? Can you talk about what sort of laws and policies have led us here?
Well, we got here the same way all the other states did and the federal institutions. It's really important for people to learn about the history of racism in our society and the connection between racism and the criminal justice system, how laws like the Black Codes after Reconstruction had such a huge effect on incarcerating Black people and giving voice really to the white supremacist views of the elites, of particularly white people with power and money, basically in our society. And so that then developed over time, of course, into Jim Crow, and police were enforcing Jim Crow. Then into the 60s, the war on drugs and all of that. And the focus has been on Black people because of a lot of factors, the structural racism in the system, the implicit racial bias, and some not implicit, clear racial bias by individuals, then the policing patterns, police being much more active in minority communities. And when the police are there, they see people doing things, they arrest them, and that gets them started in the system. And then with respect to, there's just racism throughout the entire system, from arrest to prosecution, to pretrial release decision by judges, to juries being afraid basically of Black people, white people being afraid of Black people. It's racism throughout the system by everybody. And then sentencing, same thing. Same thing with respect to then parole boards faced with questions, has this person been rehabilitated, i.e., is this person still violent and scary? And that is where all the white racism and white supremacy comes in. So it's throughout the system, and that's the challenge. But there are ways for all of us, including people in the criminal justice system, legal system, to address it. And that's really what I've been doing, along with all the other folks in Minority and Justice Commission the last 15 or so years.
Well, thank you so much. So next question I have is for everyone, but I'd like to start with Devin and Eugene. So in 2014, the Washington legislature, following the Supreme Court case, Supreme Court decision, I should say, in Miller, passed SB 5064, which allowed most people sentenced for an offense that occurred before their 18th birthday to be considered for release after serving 20 years. So Devin and Eugene, could you share a little bit how that bill, which gave a lot of people the opportunity to be considered for release, changed things for people in Washington's prison?
Sure. Eugene, you want to go first, or you have a preference?
No, no matter. You would like me to go? I'll go. I think it's really incredible what happened in 2014. I can actually remember the day, the exact day it happened. I was sitting in 2014. For perspective, that was my 23rd year in prison, and I had just turned 41 years old. And I was sitting at the table with my really good friend, David Hepard, and we were talking about stuff and just going through stuff. And there was a counselor in our unit who had always been, really fair with us and really good with us. And she came to the table and was like, hey, we just got something and I want to share it with you guys. You guys really need to have this. So she dropped it on the table and we read it. We got about halfway through, and that's all David needed to see. He was happy. He was like, man, we're going home. They're going to give us an opportunity to go home. But I kept reading, and I kept reading it to its end. And I came to the realization that it said that the crime had to happen before your 18th birthday, which meant I wasn't eligible. And so while he was really happy, I was heartbroken. I'm gonna be honest with you, man. I'm sitting with my friend and I'm happy for him, but I was heartbroken, man, because I knew what that meant for me. I knew that meant that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison. And so I was just kind of sitting there in this space of ambivalence where I was really happy, but really sad at the same time. And I was happy for him, but, feeling kind of unfortunate for myself. And so anyway, what it did for the whole population is kind of similar to what it did for me as an individual. Like, folks were really happy for their peers. Folks were really happy for people they knew, that they had built friendship with, that they had built relationship with, that they knew were going to have this opportunity to go home. But in a lot of ways, they were sad for their own self, because remember, what we're talking about only affected about 200 people, really less than 200 people in the total population that was at that time 18,000 in Washington State. So we're talking about a really minuscule number of people it was affecting. So the vast majority of population, it wasn't going to affect them. But believe it or not, it really did give hope. And it lent hope for other people to start seeing that maybe through legislation, something could happen and something good could happen. And so I seen myself over that time. Like I said, that was my 23rd year in prison. I had not yet seen, up until that point, it had been, a lot of despair, a lot of sadness, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. And that really brought about the first big wave of hope, the first big wave of guys feeling good about what it could be. And, of what could be became important for them. And so it really did something magical for the population as they saw good for their peers and good, even if it wasn't good for themselves. Because I think just how Black folks have a collective consciousness, I think in a lot of ways prisoners have a collective conscience, and we felt good to see something happening for other people who we knew were in the struggle and in the oppression that we were living in.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Youngblood. First and foremost, it created access. I think one thing I do want to highlight is that, like, in that question, I was thinking about, when folks were actually given an opportunity, that doesn't mean that when they were given the opportunity, then they began to make those transformations. I think really a lot of these transformations that folks have been experiencing, when we're talking about youthfulness, aging out, like Eugene, his transformation started way before he had an opportunity to go to the board. And I think that go to the clemency board, or a lot of guys that went before the parole board, when that opened up, it just gave them access. Again, it was a way for people to be looked at on an individual basis, because so much of what was created in the 90s and when those laws were passed were these generalizations around young Black men or young people of color. And so now folks had an opportunity to really share, who they were as an individual and the transformation that they had experienced. And I would definitely agree, the hope around what was possible in the future, because when that decision came down, it was based on science that said your brain hadn't fully developed until the age of 25. So we really felt like at some point in time that the law would catch up with the science. And I think still that's our struggle today, right? That's why we're here, is the law hasn't caught up with science, even though it's become clearer and clearer. So, yeah, definitely a lot of hope and created access. And, people could actually back in community.
Great, thank you. And for Judge Doyle, I just wanted to ask, how did that change? And by that, I mean SB 5064 and this new avenue for release. How did that change things for the system, for your perspective? Of course, these cases went before the Indeterminate Review Board and not the courts, but as a person working within the system, how did things change? Oh, Judge Doyle, if you could unmute.
Sorry. Speaking as chair of the Rules and Legislation Committee for Minority and Justice Commission, that was the first of many very significant, important bills that would allow for reconsideration of long sentences. And as you said, reflect the science, the evidence-based information that young people, all of us, when we're teenagers, have very limited judgment. And, people who commit crimes, no matter what they are, as juveniles, that certainly does not define them at all. I mean, that's a truism. I didn't see any of, I guess I wouldn't have as a judge seen the cases that under 5064 that went to the parole board, but I did have an opportunity after a state Supreme Court decision on juveniles to set a hearing in a couple of cases I had to reconsider the sentences. There was a question of whether I actually had the authority to do that. But I went ahead and did it anyway. And there was a period of time when I, as the sentencing judge, original sentencing judge, did have an opportunity to revisit those cases. And they're a great example of how absolutely absurd and really evil the sentencing grid is. I had these cases, these kids were 18 and 19 gang leaders, and they were charged in a way that required the sentencing judge, if they were convicted, to give them over 40 years in prison. So they were convicted, and there was a lot of implicit, racism in the prosecution's demonization of them. And when it came to sentencing, I didn't have any choice, but I had to give them 44 years and 50 years. And that bothered me so much afterwards. But the law was that I, as the sentencing judge, had no power to reconsider the sentence. So there was this short period of time in which the law allowed me to do that. So I set hearings, and I gave them each 20 years, I think it was. it was problematic because at that point, I had lost as a judge the authority to reduce their sentences. So I had to basically sort of convince the prosecutor not to appeal my lower sentences. And that happened. He didn't appeal. So I was able to reduce their sentences by more than 50%. But yeah, that's the problem. Sentencing judges don't have the authority to give sensible lower sentences. That's why I wrote that article about how to be an anti-racist judge. Judges can discount the criminal history that results in this sentencing range that really narrows the judge's discretion. But then, of course, you have to get judges to exercise that discretion and give the lower sentence that reflects all the evidence-based practices about young people. And they're under a tremendous pressure by prosecutors to impose long sentences that actually make the community less safe when people get out, because then they have no skills, they can't get a job, all those bad things that happen. But we are still in this retribution phase. I hope it's a phase. I hope that there's some relief, that people start to see the light. But again, the racism comes into it because, the judges, the prosecutors, everybody in the system, the white people see young Black men as dangerous. And it's totally racism. If all those young people in prison now were white, this law would have passed. All this good legislation that MJC supported and Representative Hackney has been trying to pass, I think it would have passed, because then the white community would relate to these folks, to these young people. So there's that battle that really is at the heart of the whole problem.
Thank you so much, Judge Doyle. I want to focus back on something Devin had mentioned in his answer previously, which was that 5064 really gave access. But a lot of the guys, Youngblood, Devin included, they didn't change because they saw 5064 and they're like, I can get out. They changed because they changed, and that's what human beings do. Unfortunately, there is a harmful stigma out there that people serving any prison time, but particularly life and long sentences, over 15 years, over 20 years, are, quote, the worst of the worst. And so Eugene and Devin, if you could, drawing on your personal experience, both having served a long sentence and serving alongside people who unfortunately may still be serving long sentences, could you shed some light on why the stigma is untrue, and talk a little bit about the transformative work that is going on daily in Washington state prisons, and just sort of, I guess, give space to that so that we can understand that, we need bills that will give more access to acknowledge this sort of transformative work.
Yeah, I think, to borrow from somebody Eugene mentioned, David Hepper, people don't change, they heal, right? That's one of the things that folks talk about. And I think when we're talking about stigmas, for the most part, all stigmas are bad, right? And it's really easy to try to simplify and justify the mindset of wanting to continue to punish somebody just by saying they're the worst of the worst. But when you're able to really dig and look at people's circumstances, they aren't the thing that they've done, and they aren't the thing that has happened to them, the worst thing that has happened to them. And when folks are given the opportunity to actually engage in some healing and some transformative work, they're able to grow through a lot of the challenges that they experienced that caused them to show up the way they did, which unfortunately, in these cases are really harmful, and, people may have lost their lives or whatnot. So I think that's one of the things that we really begin to realize is that, folks are actually engaging in the work, are doing healing. Before we were having healing circles, Eugene and myself were just spending time with guys that we were growing up in prison with, that, we're able to begin to understand their feelings and process and develop skills and mature out of old ways of thinking. And really, that's what maturity is about. I think if anybody who's watching this or anyone in the community, you're not the same person you were when you were 20 years old. You're not the same person you were at 15. And so it's really, I think if you can hold on to that mindset and think about, even for people that have, caused some serious harm, it's only a natural process for most folks to actually age out and to mature and to pick up some different skills. And so I think that that's, really important for folks to think about. Is like, you weren't the same person when you were 20 that you are now. Eugene isn't, I'm not. And I think if we can get past that and begin to believe in the possibilities of folks healing and showing up in a different way, we can erase those stigmas.
Man, thank you. I think it's amazing when we talk about people being labeled as the worst of the worst. And I'll try as quick as I can to give you a personal example to help you really understand, help illustrate what that means. And so when I was a young person still in prison, I was getting in a lot of trouble. I didn't have no coping strategies. I didn't understand what was going on. I was still bleeding out from the trauma I had experienced as a young person. And so I acted out in violence. I acted out with anger. I was defiant. I wasn't following any rules. And so what happened was I was labeled as the worst of the worst. And so for many years, I lived my life in a particular way that may have even led to that, right? I may have gave good reason for people to say that in the way that I was acting. And so in 2000, I had started getting my life together like about 98, but in 2000, I was at Monroe. I finally made it to Monroe, a medium security prison at the time. And I was really happy. That was like the place to be. They had the most programming. It was the most place you can get out free from your cell. They had the best schooling opportunities for people. And so I was there, and what happened, they had a riot. And I wasn't physically involved in the riot, but I got sent out. And when I got sent out, the wording that went along with the infraction for me was, Youngblood is a threat to the orderly operations of the institution. He's charismatic. He has too much influence. He can talk to people from any race, any gang, any religious spectrum, and that alone makes him dangerous. So we're gonna send him out of here and he can never come back. I got sent out of Monroe. I went back to Walla Walla. So I went back to square one. 15 years later, in 2017, the Department of Corrections head in Olympia called and said, we want to transfer Eugene Youngblood to Monroe on what's called an institutional needs transfer, because we need to have his presence at Monroe to run this program. We're starting a peer-to-peer teaching program, and we don't want nobody else to be ahead of this but him. And the reason why is because he's one of the best of the best. And we tout him as being one of the best of the best. And this is why, because he's articulate, he's charismatic, and he's has too much influence over everybody. He has the ability to talk to people from different races, different gangs, different religious organizations. So in essence, they used the very same argument to say that I was the worst of the worst that they made to say I was the best of the best. So what's the question is, was I the worst of the worst, or was I the best of the best? And the answer is I was both. And it just depends on when you caught me. If you caught me early and I still was dealing with my trauma and I still was bleeding out, it appeared to you that I was the worst of the worst. But if you caught me later and I had been through a healing process and I understood some things better and I've gained some coping mechanisms and some coping strategies, then you would say I was the best of the best. But really the whole time I was the same person. Right? And just depends on where I was at in my life and my maturity. When you caught me at 18 or 19 or 20, you thought one thing. When you caught me at 35 and 40, you thought another thing. And I would be remiss if I didn't add this last point to that. And that is my friend and my mentor, Dominic Davis from Community Passageways, taught me this. And he taught me that those people who they label in the worst of the worst, they didn't just fall out of the sky. They didn't just become overnight, and they wasn't born and bred that way. What happened is they was raised in conditions that created such a thing that they acted in that way. And so while we can get rid of this person that you're calling the worst of the worst, somebody else comes behind them and somebody else comes behind them, because we're never addressing the root cause. We're never getting down to the problem, which is the environment. And we're not talking about the environment that produced these people you see in front of you that you're labeling as the worst from the worst. And so until we start dealing with those circumstances that create this type of behavior, we're never really going to address the problem.
Can I just add one additional thing?
Please, absolutely.
I think it's really important because like you'll see me in Youngblood and a handful of people that are in these spaces. And I just want to dispel any belief that there's like this exceptionality to us, right? There's a lot of people who are getting out of prison, who are doing well. They might not be in the social justice space, but they were once labeled worst of the worst, but they're out there holding down jobs. They're out there taking care of their families. They're out there starting businesses. They're out there doing all of the things, right? And they never get highlighted, right? They never get showcased so that they can also dispel, because a lot of people could look at both of us and some of the people that we work with and say, oh, well, you know, these are great anecdotes, but the truth is, you know, that's, you know, this isn't the standard for everyone else. And when in reality, there's countless numbers of people who are out here doing really great work in their own personal ways. And I think that highlights the fact that there's thousands of individuals also on the inside who still haven't had their opportunity at, you know, or that access to a board or to a judge so that they can have their opportunity to show up in community the way that they should or that they can.
Please, Judge Doyle.
If I could add to that, I mean, it's always made me really angry that we expect people, we only allow people out of prison on these ridiculously long sentences if they're, you know, if they're like a minister or they're absolutely perfect in every way. It's the system that's wrong. It's that we take kids who have all these problems because of poverty and racism and everything else, and instead of helping them, like sending them to community passageways, which I try to do a lot of, instead of doing that, we send them to prison where everybody gets worse because it's a horrible environment. We should be able to revisit everybody's sentence, not just people who, you know, have suddenly become the most wonderful people in the world, like Mr. Youngblood and Mr. Adams. We should be able to revisit everybody's sentence because it's the system that made the mistake. Right from the beginning, society at large not providing communities with the resources that they need, the racism in the system, and then this inane legal system we have that requires judges to put people in prison for decades. Thank you.
Absolutely. And you know, that I would just say on behalf of FAMM, you know, we fight today for HB 1344, but, you know, in the mind of FAMM and our second chances agenda, you know, what you mentioned, Judge Doyle, that's the end game is make sure everybody has the opportunity to come out from under these harmful sentences. And, you know, you alluded to this and kind of addressed it head on in your remarks. But if there was anything else you'd want to say, Judge Doyle, from your perspective as a judge involved in sentencing, you know, why these long sentences are so ineffective, specifically as it relates to public safety, because a lot of folks make the argument that these long sentences are required by public safety. We want to keep people safe. These people have to go away for a long time. You speak to how that is ineffective from the framework of public safety. If you could,
Sorry, I'm muted again. It's been known for decades that incarcerating people for long periods of time does not keep the community safer. It makes the community less safe because then you have a lot of people coming out of prison who, you know, have the stigma of the conviction, you know, the whole reentry problem that affects ability to get a job, housing, everything else. So it's really the worst thing we can do to protect the community. And law enforcement is quite aware of all the research. And there are a few people in law enforcement that recognize that and hence are supportive of changing the sentencing laws, of diverting young people out of the legal system and giving them an opportunity to address, not when we talk about rehabilitation, it connotes that the person did a lot of awful things and it's their own fault. It doesn't reflect the reality of impoverished communities where kids, are both their parents are immigrants and they're working 2 or 3 jobs, and that's why they can't, be home all the time and monitoring young people. Plus, it's poverty and racism and everything else. It's really like Dom Davis says, it's correcting the problems in the system. It's making some effort to give these young people a modicum of the advantages that middle-class white kids have. That's the reason we don't have all these kids from Laurelhurst and, other communities of wealth in the system, because they're not policed and they don't have all the problems that the system has wrought on the low-income minority communities.
Thank you so much. So I want to turn to Devin real quick, unless you had something to add to that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, the judge had highlighted, how prison is ineffective and longer sentences are ineffective. And I think what people have to really, if for those that don't understand, prison is a traumatic environment. So when you take people that come from traumatic backgrounds and have experienced trauma their entire lives and then put them into prison, it's state violence, right? And so the answer to violence was more violence, with the expectation of once a person completes their sentence that they come back to a community in a healed state or in a whole state, which that just doesn't make sense. If the response to violence is violence, you can't expect a person realistically to come home and to be able to show up in a way that is healthy. And I think that's one of the things that we fail to miss, is like, people try to pretty up prison and, allow certain programs and do certain things to make it not as nice or as harmful as it is, but it's still prison. There's still a culture inside of prison where it's a very adversarial environment that creates conflict and tension, and it's really hard to navigate. And it's fortunate. I think it really speaks to the fact that there's thousands of individuals who, despite those circumstances, are still figuring out ways to engage in some healing practices and come home. And even in the transition of coming back into community, it can be traumatic, because you can do all this work and then you go back to an environment like the judge and Eugene have been talking about and Dom talk about, where conditions are horrible and you're expected to thrive or to be resilient, I guess, in these spaces, which is, it's really, I think it's really important for people to understand how harmful prison is, and the fact that people are still healing inside of that speaks to the human spirit and people's desires to actually move through the things that they've experienced.
Thank you for that. And I could not have written a better segue if I tried, because my next question is for you, Devin. We've talked about healing and the violence of prison and these systems, how they don't help us. Your organization, Collective Justice, engages in alternatives to holding people accountable and ensuring that everyone heals and promoting that. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to your work and your organization's work and its benefits. And
so first, Collective Justice Agency, that was really born out of conversations in community of folks that were survivors of harm, who were really feeling let down by the system as it currently exists. For most people who have been survivors of harm, that the system essentially uses you as a tool to either get a harder punishment or to get a conviction. And then once that process is over with, they pretty much discard you. And so the only sense of accountability that a person will ever receive that goes through that system is punishment. And that's what people have been conditioned or taught to think that accountability is like punishment. And, and then on the other side of that, there were folks inside of prison. Eugene was there. We were a part of the Black Prisoners Caucus and the Concerned Lifers organization. And for years, folks have been inside trying to figure out ways that, we can heal and make amends with community. And, through our conversation with Martina Cartman and Dr. Catherine Beckett, the conversation came around, how do we generate some opportunities for some restorative justice practices? And Martina and Dr. Beckett went out and figured out a way and created this curriculum and was able to hold space for folks in community and folks on the inside. And, really what we found was on the inside of someone who has caused harm was, people don't show up the way they do out of a vacuum, like Eugene said. And really, we were able to redefine what accountability means. And so even in the question, like, how do we hold other people accountable? I think first we have to learn how to practice self-accountability and understand how when we show up certain ways and it's harmful to other people, what do we do to correct that? And so really what we're doing is holding healing circles for folks. We've got like 5 or 6 different healing circles that we're holding. And we also offer direct dialogues between folks who have experienced harm and caused harm as a way to get to having people who have experienced harm have their voice heard and have a sense of create a sense of obligation from the person to do what they can to make that right. And what we found is that when people are given the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with someone who has caused them harm, they would prefer that system offers, which is a harsh sentence. And I think the fact that when we look at it, for each person that continues to go through the current system, when a sentence is handed down, in most circumstances, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, the person who has experienced harm or the family member who lost a loved one is still in just as much pain as they were the day that crime happened. And so what I would offer is that accountability as we currently know it when it comes to punishment isn't healing anyone and it's not making anyone safer. It's actually just continuing to perpetuate harm.
Thank you so much. And my last question, before I give our panelists an opportunity to just sort of give some final remarks. And this question's for everybody, so please feel free to jump in. And this goes off what Devin was saying. Drawing on your personal and professional experience, could you speak about how legislation like HB 1344 that would give people the opportunity to go home from these excessive and unnecessary sentences is not inconsistent with what I think should be a universal goal, which is addressing the harms of survivors and victims and serving their needs while also serving the needs of the people who are incarcerated. So if we could just speak to how these two goals are not incompatible. We can bring folks home while serving the needs of survivors and victims.
I'll let the judge start.
I'm sorry, you want me to start? Well, they're clearly not inconsistent. I mean, the only way we can have public safety is to have a rehabilitative system that supports people and addresses their needs. But the problem is it's very difficult to get that legislation through the legislature, especially the conservative Republicans, and there are a few conservative Democrats as well. Representative Hackney and some other wonderful legislators have proposed not just this bill, but a number of other bills. A Minority and Justice Commission also supported, but it's very difficult to change people's minds when especially when they get law enforcement and the prosecutors pressuring them to not support the legislation. And they worry, of course, about getting reelected. And so it's tough. It's tough for groups like ours, I'll say, including MJC, to work through that. And so here's just some political advice that I've got for this coming legislative session. we need to find people in each district. If you need some representatives vote, find voters in that district to contact that legislator, because the voters are the legislators' employers, really. They're going to listen to that person more than they're going to listen to, say, me or you, who are in some other legislative district. So it's that kind of focus, I think, that really could have a lot of effect. And then it's just contacting all the community groups, contacting the legislators and showing their support for bills, because we're up against law enforcement, which is really, really tough. So maybe Representative Hackney would want to respond to that. I don't know if he agrees with me or not.
I will say Representative Hackney had to jump off the panel today.
Okay.
Eugene, Devin, do you have anything to add to the question of inconsistency between the victims and this legislation?
Yeah, I think that the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? I think people will try to make you think that these things can't exist at once. And they always try to have some antagonism between folks who have caused harm and folks who have harmed. And a lot of ways they pit one against the other and make it strictly antagonistic, like the Bloods and the Crips, right? Like there's really a beef. And really what happens is, what I found is that people who have caused harm, what happened is we don't really always understand or be able to appreciate the gravity of what we have done and the long-reaching effects until we have an opportunity to be confronted by, or to be in a room with, or be in relationship with people who have been harmed. And then we get an understanding of the real harm that we have caused and the ripple effects that it has. And I think conversely, people who have been harmed don't really believe that folks heal, right? Because they've been served this thing on a platter saying that people change. And it's just something about unconsciously, you really don't believe that a person can go from being this to that. So it's the language. So when we keep saying change, 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 and people change, what happens is they believe that this isn't true. But when we start to say people heal, they recognize within themselves, well, there's been things that happened to me that I need to heal from. And I haven't always showed up at my best self, right? And when I didn't show up at my best self, I would hope that my wife or my children or somebody would give me some grace and give me some space and allow me to come back and again, repay them or repay that by showing up at my best when I can. And so I think the main thing we got to remember when we're talking about 1344 is these are children. We're talking about young people. And we get away from that. We get to just talking about people. These are young people, and the emphasis has to be right. So put it in proper perspective. At 18 years old, I was arrested, and my biggest thing that I should have been worried about was my upcoming graduation. I should have been worried about who I was going to take to the prom and what I was going to wear to the prom. And instead, I was standing trial and getting ready to be sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison. And so just think about what that does to your psyche. And then understand what that means really, and then we understand when we look at it from that perspective, we understand, wait a minute, yeah, these are really young people. And then you think about how counterintuitive it is that because somebody does something wrong, we want to reward them by treating them as an adult, right? But we don't, if your daughter is doing AP math and she's 16 years old, they don't say, oh yeah, we're going to elevate her to adulthood early and we're going to let her start buying alcohol or join the army or something because she's doing really great, right? But instead, the people who are doing bad, the people who drop out of school, the people who aren't getting proper care services, the people who don't have anything are going through this trauma, these are the people we want to graduate to adulthood early. Like that doesn't even make any sense. Like that's counterintuitive. So we just need to bring more awareness to that these are children and quit looking at the label and effect that people try to put on with the crime they have committed. And just, we have to still understand these are young people and they have to have a room for change, room for growth, room for transformation, room for healing ultimately, so that we can all be able to do this and go through this process. And then you will see what shows up before you be a totally different construct as opposed to what was once in front of you.
Yeah, that was dope. I think like when we examine the current system as it exists, it's very inconsistent when it comes to meeting the needs of survivors, right? Like again, you sentence a person, and then after a person is sentenced, the people who have experienced the harm are left to essentially fend for themselves. So their needs, at no point in time is the state even asking folks like what their needs are, right? They just assume and that what they need is justice, which is punishment, which doesn't bring them any healing. It doesn't bring them any of the things that could actually help them move through the trauma that they've experienced. And it's not anyone's fault because we've been conditioned from a very young that accountability is punishment. And that's the one tool that we have when it comes to justice. And frankly, the judge has been real clear about it. I think when we talk about survivors, right, and survivors' needs, what's put in front of the camera is white women from suburban communities, when we know that the people who are experiencing most harm are people from Black and brown communities. And no one has ever taken the time to ask them what their needs are. But when folks are actually engaging with community, what they're finding is that, they would prefer alternatives if they were given the option. And so I think that's really where we need to center. Those are the folks that we need to center and listen to. And that's how we can begin to kind of dispel these rumors or these myths around what by allowing someone an opportunity to be released back in the community, it's going to cause more harm to folks that have experienced harm. I think when folks are actually able to engage with one another, because a lot of the times we're all from the same communities, right? And we're returning back to the same communities. And so when folks are able to have a process to heal, those rumors are dispelled and people can see that their needs are actually able to be met and there is a pathway to healing and people are being united back in the community.
Well, thank you so much. And, I could sit and speak with the three of you for hours, but I do want to let everyone have their afternoons and especially their lunch. So I just wanted to end by thanking our three panelists, Devin, Eugene, and Judge Doyle, for an excellent conversation. We'll certainly have more of these down the line. There's a lot to talk about, but more importantly, a lot of work to get done in ensuring these kind of legislation get passed. So again, I want to thank our excellent panelists. I want to thank our co-hosts for the event, Look to Justice, and of course, all the attendees for joining us today. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Daniel.
Love to everyone who came and participated. We appreciate having you here. Every little piece counts.
For sure.